Okay, today it's good afternoon rather than good morning. I usually do these early Tuesday morning, but today, just because of a whole host of reasons, I'm doing them Monday afternoon. So greetings, but you'll listen to them whatever time. So greetings, I hope you're all staying happy and healthy, or at least healthy. We're talking about a little bit of a depressing topic today, and unfortunately a little more topical than I had expected. Just so you know, the interesting thing was, I had actually planned to focus on the Black Death anyway, even when I was deciding this in December, before I had any idea that we'd be in the grips of a global pandemic when we got here. Although we were going to talk more about, I was going to do more on the Mongol Empire, and I kind of focused more on the Black Death, but that was going to be more too, we were going to have like 2 classes, and it was going to be a normal class. So it's a little bit coincidental, but I focused a bit more on that. But the primary source in the Black Death I'd actually already selected before the beginning of the semester. Anyway, this is your exam question. The Black Death devastated China, the Islamic world, and Europe in the 1300s. Using the World Together textbook, the primary source on the Black Death, which is both about, doesn't talk about China, but it does talk about the Islamic world and Europe, on Moodle, and the lecture compared the impact of the Black Death in these 3 regions. What were 2 important similarities, and what was different about each region? How did each region recover, and what can we learn from this recovery? And I guess what can we learn from this recovery is going to be something that you're going to be more thinking of yourself, although I'll say a few words about that at the end of the lecture. Okay, so first, the spread of the Black Death. And as I said before, this kind of connects with what we talked about with the Mongols, which is why I chose to focus when I had to leave some stuff out of my original lecture. Why I chose to keep them focused on the Mongols, is because it goes very well. It's hard to understand the Black Death without understanding the Mongols. It spread on trade routes, and this is what we talked about before. One of the big ironies, the crowning achievement of the Mongols was their magnificent trade routes. It did bring prosperity to the empire, and it was actually other places were starting to heal. And again, if this had continued, it's hard to say what would have happened. But it had a chance to, but in fact, instead, the Black Death spread on their trade routes. It's pretty clear. As we know now, they didn't know at the time, but we know now how bubonic plague spreads. There's fleas bite rats, and then the rats die, and then the fleas, when all the rats die, and the fleas actually would prefer the rats, but when they don't have the rats, they come and they bite humans. And that's how it transfers this way. And there's, of course, the connection between they're both diseases that started in animals and then transferred and made a jump to humans, and those tend to be pretty dangerous diseases when they first do this. Now, after a while, that people develop a sort of immunity, although there's a debate about how much immunity people develop to the plague. That's another question that people debate. But some scholars, a lot of scholars do hold that their immunity developed over time. So it spread through the Mongol trade routes, which were not through Europe, but they stopped in Italy in 1346 in Kaffa. And then what happened is the beginning of your, I didn't require you, of course, to read the whole World Together chapter. The beginning of the chapter gives a very dramatic description of this. So the ship takes off, and everything is fine, but then people start to get sick. And they start to and the bubonic plague, that's why it's called the Black Death. It was horrific. People literally started, their bodies started swelling. Parts of it would turn not like a beautiful black color, black skin, but like a diseased black, basically like a rotting black. It's very, very different from black. I just want to be really clear about that. It's not just that it was like a black skin. It was like parts of their body would start to rot very quickly, and it was horrible. So you'd see this swelling, this horrible swelling. And so they get to the next port, and the people basically, they're like, we don't know what God, you don't know what you did to make God so angry at you, or we don't know what happened or why you're like this, but we don't want any part of this. They don't know about germs. They don't know about how things can spread, but there is a sense that if somebody has something really sick, that if you're around them, you can get sick too, even though they don't know how. That's been noticed. That's been kind of inescapably noticed. So just get out. But here's the thing, and I ask them, usually if I have an in-person class, I can ask them, and I can actually ask my daughter's here with me. She decided she wanted to listen. It's kind of a gory lecture, but she finds this kind of interesting. So if the people didn't get off Mira, who do you think did get off? So there's a
The
ship.
rats, the
rats, and the fleas on the rats. Exactly. They couldn't keep the rats from getting out. If you've heard of rats of a sinking ship, so they were in port long enough that the rats came out. So then the rats were in that city, and then the fleas were able to spread there. And then they spread, and then it went to another area. And then they went someplace else, and again, it was even worse. And people were like, no, get away. And then it docked there, and then the rats got off there, the more rats got off there. It's just, and then, so then it kept having, because if, it kept going, the ship kept going from port to port, and the rats kept getting off, and that's one way that it was able to spread all throughout Western Europe. And then from there, because of these were also trading ports, they spread all throughout, as they said, through all throughout the country. It went to France, to England, and you could read more about the specifics in your textbook. Some people have suggested that it was kind of a germ warfare, that the Mongols deliberately made the merchants sick because they understood this and wanted to use this because they had the sickness and they understood they could spread it. There's the idea that they threw the bodies over. They threw sick bodies over walled cities, and that's another kind of debate. It's not clear how that the Mongols actually meant to infect anybody, but there's an idea that some people have said that the Mongols actually deliberately infected them. That's probably not true, but that is an idea. Like, did they use this germ warfare? Your textbook talks about the impact of climate. There was a climate change, colder climate. It was actually becoming colder, like climate change. We would never, I want to be clear about this, when you hear about the impact of climate, there's nothing compared to what's happening now. Now humans have impacted climates like they never have before. So there's never been anything like what's happening now. But climates do go through cycles. And then this was it became harder to grow food. And then at the same time, you're also seeing the social thing, because the lords would just squeeze the peasants harder and harder. So you had a lot of weakness, especially among peasants during this time as well. And your textbook also suggests that the drier conditions may have driven the rats out as well. So the rats may have been more in the human population as well. It didn't start in China proper, but it started in southwest China. I'm going to show you that momentarily in this map, actually, now. So here's the map, and as you can see, you see the trade routes. I showed you this before. You see the trade routes, and you see the bubonic plague going right on the trade routes, almost kind of perfectly. And then you see, you can see it spreading in Italy, and then spreading throughout Paris, and then it goes to Britain as well, and that becomes one of the major outbreaks. If you look at the red dots, it started. It started in Yunnan, which is southwestern China, if you look 1320. But it actually became, if you look at the dates, there's an idea that somehow it started in China and then spread to Europe. It spread on the Mongol trade routes, but a lot of Chinese outbreaks were after the European outbreaks. So it's not quite like it took over China and then went into Europe. But yeah, this is a map that shows what happened. And again, I showed you this map before in the last lecture, but it's worth kind of looking at again to understanding this in a new way. So how did the Black Death contribute to the end of the Mongol dynasty? Basically, it's difficult to rule when the disease threw everything into chaos. You're seeing some in Europe as well. I didn't get into this as much because I didn't have you read all the different changes, but you're also seeing instability in Europe, where the Western Europe, where the Mongols didn't rule. But this provided conditions for rebellion, and Mongol brutality and conquering still remembered. Even though they were less brutal in China, as I said, that left Hangzhou intact, and they'd actually had a lot of rule. They had actually they hadn't used soft power very well, so they had never really endeared themselves to the people that they were conquering. And in the Middle East, of course, there was actual brutality in conquering. And so the perceptions of Mongols as barbarians who couldn't take care of anything increased. Nobody was able to deal with the Black Death. It was something that was completely unprecedented, that they wouldn't have been, that almost nobody was able to. So in a way, this was a little bit unfair for the Mongols, that they were barbarians, and that's why they couldn't control them. But nonetheless, they hadn't endeared themselves to the people enough that they would retain loyalty through this very, very difficult time. So this is how this big change happened. So the Mongol Empire collapsed. So impact of Black Death. Your death rates give your textbook gives a rate of 25% to 65%. Some argue for higher in some places. It depends on locality and class. Urban areas were more affected than rural areas, for example. Class, when I say class, I mean economic standing. Wealthier people died. Rich people definitely died, but poorer people died more. Wealthier people had more resources to try and help them deal with it. That they weren't always successful in this because they didn't understand how to deal with it. They didn't understand about germ theory. So certainly a lot of rich and wealthy people died. That's true, but poorer people died more and in higher percentages. The European population was reduced by 1/3. The Chinese population from about 120 million to about 80 million. And Middle East, also great deal of death as well. We don't have the figures for the Middle East in the same way because it hadn't completely, as we talked about this before, recovered enough from the Mongol invasion. There wasn't enough order to really have clear census records. But there's from anecdotal reports, you hear about massive death. In everywhere that you see, all these three major areas that we're talking about, there's definitely the idea of supernatural origins. That there was there were very different religious ideas in all three places that we've discussed before, but it did seem like some punishment from above that people didn't understand about bacteria at the time. And what some people have actually said, even in the quiz, I've even seen a few people say this in the quizzes. Only a few people I've only looked at a few quizzes so far, but they've talked about the fact that even today, someone talked about the idea that today people are saying it's from God and everything. So even now, there's that perception. Although, generally speaking, because of the people understand the mechanism of this, people aren't turning to supernatural origins as a society. It's not as popular. It's what you might call a little bit. I think it would be called a fringe response. But it's still even today you can see some of this. Higher death rates in urban areas, although plague outbreaks everywhere, and the wealthier people obviously had more of an ability to flee, so they did flee more. They did flee. Although this was different, that's one of the things I want to talk about why it's different. And this is something that your textbook didn't tell you that I'm going to be mentioning when I talk about the Islamic Empire. That is something that you see that's a little bit different. But the wealthier did generally have the more ability to flee. States lost legitimacy. Mongol dynasty in Middle East and China, but also in Europe, you see the states losing legitimacy as well because they just couldn't handle this as well. Not as dramatically in Europe as in the Middle East and China. In all the three areas we talked about, China, the Middle East, and Europe, stronger states replaced what came before. And what's interesting is even though in the time that the Mongol Empire, the time of the Black Death, it seemed like everything was fully falling apart and life would never go back to the way it was. And in a way life was very different afterwards in many ways. But it was also a turn back to tradition. So people did not completely abandon their traditions. After the worst of the Black Death fell, and as your textbook says, there were actually spikes of it afterwards. It wasn't like it was all over and it was never heard from again. But when things became more normal, when life became more back to normal, you did see a turn back to traditions. But of course the traditions were very different, so we're going to see this in different ways in all three regions, but that's one commonality that you see. So here are some commonalities that you see, and we're going to talk about some different. The Black Death in Europe. Persecution of Jews. The most popular was the persecution of Jews. There were also more persecution of Muslims, people who are witches. Your textbooks mentions prostitutes. People who we'd now call lesbian and gay also did, but then that was understood so differently that I'm not going to, that would be almost a whole other lecture. The thing that was most relevant, that you saw most of, is persecution of people who were Jewish. And that was the most massive, the most noteworthy and massive thing that you saw in Europe. Is the idea that the people who were Jewish there were people who were Jewish who were a minority in Europe. They were a religious minority. There was a lot of anti-Semitic persecution. It would sort of come and go in different times, different regions more than others. But you definitely saw this, and you saw them blaming on the outsiders. An interesting connection that some people have made is that there's, and I hope not broadly, but there's discrimination against people of Asian descent, even people who have never been to China at all. But the idea that this, the Wuhan, they're calling it the Wuhan virus, saying it came from China, which it did in fact originate in China, but it came to the United States actually just as a side thing more from Europe, if you're talking about the current times. But there's this idea of kind of persecuting people who are seen as minorities or are seen as other in society, and you definitely are seeing persecution of people of Asian descent here, and that's people have made some connections there between this idea of kind of turning on people who, who some, of course, people of Asian descent are not outsiders at all in the United States, but that's a perception sometimes, and so that's a connection people have made. And I wanted you to focus on that in text. That's why I put that in a quiz question: is true or false. You see massive people fleeing urban areas and leaving others to die, leaving even family members to die. I'm going to talk more about that. You definitely see the breakdown of traditional morality among some people, and then some people have increased piety. So this is what your textbook and also what your primary source talked about, that some people just would basically go from house to house and drink and eat because other people were dying anyway. So they would try to avoid the sick, but they'd go in groups and they would just basically get drunk all day, and they would just basically forget everything. And then some people would try to pray all day, and as it said, as the text said, both people died. So the primary sources that you were reading were people who were actually observing at the time, and that's different, of course, than when you read the textbooks, and that's somebody kind of writing about it later. The fleeing of priests weakened the church a lot. Some priests did sacrifice their lives to stay and minister to people and help people, but many people fled. Many people fled the areas of plague because that was the surest way. That was actually even though they didn't understand germ theory, and they thought that if they actually held something that smelled good up into their mouth, they would actually be able to help them. There were just other ideas. Like there's an idea that somehow if something smelled bad, that was what was making people sick. So if they could hold a rose up, not rose, but like flowers or different flowers up to their noses, they might actually be better. Now, the primary source talked about abandoning family members, and they talked about parents abandoning children. And some people in the early quizzes I've read, like, how common was that? And it is a disturbing idea, because the mother-child or the parent-child bond is so sacred in our culture, and their culture as well. And that's obviously why he said it was very shocking. How often did it happen? It's hard to say because there aren't records of that. It was only mentioned in the European source. That it wasn't discussed in Islamic sources. We didn't really see it discussed in China, although it might have happened and just not been discussed. It might have just been something he observed once, and then kind of in his memory, because it was so shocking, it became bigger for him. Certainly, I want to make clear that it wasn't that all parents were abandoning their children at this point. That did not happen on a massively wide scale. But there are other sources that suggest that this did happen at times. And certainly less close family ties, like cousins or uncles, or I think were actually more common. But most parents did not there weren't parents abandoning children on a very, very wide scale. So I do want to kind of address that. Primary sources, your textbooks have to be really accurate. When you read a primary source, what you're reading is somebody's impressions and ideas at the time. So they're really valuable, and they give you evidence of it. This is what people were thinking about at the time. But certain things might stick out to people's minds more. This wasn't somebody who was actually doing kind of a scientific survey of this. So church and state and recover in Europe after recovery. You definitely see monarchies. You see more of an emphasis on divine right to rule, and this was a connection that you can see through all three of them. In the Islamic, there was more kind of connection with the Islamic rulers, with the basically the sanction of Islam to rule, and then the Ming, they have the mandate of heaven. I'm going to talk more about that when I get to each of those. One thing that's different in Europe was the lack of a centralized language. As your text mentioned, Latin had sort of formed a centralized language, but it was becoming weaker and weaker. It was still the language of scholarship. Like, educated people could all read and speak Latin, and that gave a sort of educated elite could communicate with each other. But it was becoming less and less common to have a really good knowledge of Latin. Latin was becoming less central at this point in Europe. So you really compare this to China, and when I talked about the early in the semester about different writing systems, you really see this come into play now. China is the only one. We're going to talk about how it's the most centralized bureaucracy. We'll talk more about that. The only one which actually has one writing system that holds everything together. Europe doesn't have that. So you have a lot of smaller kingdoms, like we call it England and France. Now kind of as sort of developed as kind of identities. Now, what would develop as the Netherlands, Holland, and then Spain, Portugal. There were more conflicts between those, and so that's again a comparison you can make to the Ming Dynasty. The church recovered. The church had fallen into less repute because of the fact that the priests were fleeing. Although again, not all priests did. But you see the recovery of the church growing stronger here, and more charitable functions. They did more giving to the poor. At the same time, there was also more persecution against religious minorities, so Muslims and people who are Jewish, and this is anti-Semitism especially flared. Not everywhere, like in the Netherlands, it didn't flare in the same way, but as a rule, you're seeing more persecution, and this is a way of kind of strengthening the church. And you have something else that's kind of interesting in the way of the Black Death. As they were trying to, the church was trying to reestablish itself and become stronger, and so there's more charity, but you need money for these charitable functions, and you need also, unfortunately, you need money for religious persecution as well, actually. So they started the selling of indulgences, and what that means, your text discusses this, but I kind of wanted you to make this connection as well. The selling of indulgences were basically, if you were really rich, you could buy something, and either your grandfather or your father or your mother or some parent or some other family member would have to, or perhaps you yourself, but a lot of times it was for family members, would have to spend less time in purgatory. They would actually, if there's an idea that you wouldn't get to heaven right away, you'd have to spend some time in purgatory, and you could actually basically buy your way into heaven. And this was actually something that was a big part of fueling the Protestant Reformation, which actually didn't take place until much later, until later in the 1500s, so we're talking about later on. But a lot of people see this is when you started seeing the selling of indulgences. A lot of people see this as a reaction to trying to get money for the church to recover itself, which would lead to a major schism in the church later on. So this is really important, the end of feudalism in Europe. The high death rate among the peasants gave those remaining more power to negotiate wages. You had a higher death rate among poorer people, and the poor people who didn't die had more. Basically, they really need people to grow food to have a society work, right? And so the lords who had this land was useless if they didn't have people to grow food for them, right? So they needed this. What the nobles wanted, of course, was to keep the peasants the way it was before, was to keep the peasants tied to their land so they wouldn't have to give them any more, so things could stay the same. And they didn't want this. Obviously, they wanted more freedom of movement so they could negotiate the best deals. And you, in your text, hopefully you read about the peasant revolts that happened. There were higher wages in some European regions than others, but there were higher wages for about even more than 100 years following the Black Death, this way. If you do the extra credit, you don't have to, but the extra credit has a whole chart and talks about this. But basically you see it in England and France to some extent, but less so in Spain, and there's a whole host of reasons for that I'm not going to try to confuse you by discussing, but if you're interested, you can look at this. And another interesting thing that you can see more about if you look at the extra credit lecture, is the extra credit lecture is by a major scholar of the Black Death, John Abarth. And what he suggests, what's interesting, is what people did with their higher wages is a lot of the peasants, they actually chose leisure over more money. And this is actually something that was critiqued by the richer people who actually wanted them to work more. But if they could get higher wages, they might work 3 or 4 days a week, or they might actually take more time. They didn't go on vacation in the same way they do now, but take more time just for leisure, to relax more, to have more time. And they might have been growing more food for themselves, so it might have been a good economic decision. But it's kind of an interesting thing about what's more valuable to you. And I think in our society, we would always think, well, more money is more valuable. The smartest thing to do is to get more money. But in this time, some people might have thought that leisure, time for themselves, was more important than money. So it's an interesting kind of speculation about this, what's more valuable. But yeah, so some of them made more money, and some of them were able to get land more, actually, because there's so many people who are dying, land was cheaper, so some of them were able to buy land for themselves. Sometimes peasants were able to be landowners on their own. But some chose, who remained peasants, some chose leisure over money. So that's another interesting thing. But you definitely see the end of feudalism. The end of feudalism is very directly tied to the Black Death in Europe. So Black Death in the Middle East. This region was not fully recovered from the Mongol destruction when the plague began, but in the wake of the plague, with the plague, it was absolute chaos. The primary source talks about the disappearance of trades. People just stopped doing, because the only they could make more money, rather than being woodworkers or anything else, whatever else they were doing. They stopped and they became grave diggers, or they did something with the funeral trade. So that became the only trade that was really still going on. All wedding celebrations were discontinued, that's actually something that we can connect. I don't think we certainly can't understand the huge impact, the massive numbers of death. We're nowhere near that with COVID-19, but we do. I think some things like the discontinuation of normal life, maybe we have a little bit more of a sense of than we would have before. So celebrations were discontinued. Their textbook doesn't say this, and neither does the primary source. So this is something that you need to get from the lecture. That's interesting. You didn't see the same Jewish persecution. You didn't see this persecution against religious minorities. And because anti-Semitism persecution was so pronounced in Europe as a result of Black Death, it's especially notable that there wasn't anti-Jewish persecution there in the same way. And there's we don't really know, there's a whole host of arguments about why that would be, but that's a difference. Another interesting and important difference is that fleeing was forbidden by Islam. That basically it's the idea that, so the religious idea was that God is causing this, and fleeing isn't going to help. That you just have to come and you have to deal with it, and you have to die. If God wants you to die, you just have to accept this. And a little bit when you read the primary source, you can see them talking about doing more good deeds and just preparing yourself for death. That was what according to the religious conflicts you were supposed to do if plague came to you. You were supposed to prepare yourself for death. But at the same time, even though Islam was the primary religion and most doctors were Islamic, they were Muslim, but there are different ideas in it. So there was a medical versus religious conflict. And again, you can see that the extra credit lecture actually talks about this in more detail. But some of the medical, some people who were doctors at the time was like, no, you should flee. If you flee, you can save your life. And the idea of the when the religious order said you can't flee, they basically said you're basically killing people. You're sentencing people to death. Which I guess from the religious perspective was like, yeah, okay, we're sentencing people to death, but that's still the right thing to do. There aren't the same reports of mass fleeing as in Europe, and we don't see, this was something that I asked a question about in the quiz. The original answer that I had in mind was the idea that you don't see any reports about abandoning family members in Islam. That might have happened, but it wasn't discussed in the same way. And there wasn't the same, I think because fleeing was more difficult in general, people thought about it more, there was more conflict about it, more, I guess, discussion. People didn't just take off in the same way as you see in Europe. There aren't those same reports about this. So out of this chaos, 3 Islamic empires rose: Ottoman, Safavid, Mughal. I'm just going to say a little bit about each. In my modern global history class, I talk a lot about each of these 3 empires. I'm going to just really talk about them in very quickly here. Arabic is still the most important language, but you have Turkish and Persian rulers. So this is kind of an interesting switch you see in the Islamic world as well, to more of a Turkish and Persian focus of this as rulers go. So the Ottoman Empire, it started in 1326. It lasted until 1918. It was very small originally, but they were the people who were best, the Ottomans who actually started, before the plague broke out. But as the plague broke out, they turned out to be the people who were best at administrating. They were good military rulers as well, but when they took over territories, they were able to rule them well in this chaos. And the Ottoman Empire lasted until 1918. It was much weaker. From about the 1800s onward, it was a lot weaker. But by the time it did, but it had until the 1700s, it was very, very strong. So about 400 years more than 400 years of really being strong and vibrant, and close to 500 years in existence is impressive for an empire. This was a multilingual, multicultural empire, and you can see if you look on this, so look on the map that's right here. I can't point for anything, but you can look and see Istanbul, which became Constantinople. This is what I said here. There's a whole song about that. Istanbul is Constantinople, was Constantinople, and that's this thing. So they actually took over the Byzantine Empire, which was Constantinople, and they made it Istanbul. And so you see the original it's Turkey, and then you can see them moving into Eastern Europe, that's the purple, and moving into North Africa, and moving into the Middle East as well. And the pink is when they're moving in the Middle East. And Mesopotamia is modern-day Iraq. So you can see, and later on Yemen, Tripoli, which is modern-day Libya. They couldn't make it into Spain, into Europe, but you can definitely see Greece, Bulgaria. So most of Eastern Europe fell under was under Ottoman rule as well, and North Africa was under Ottoman rule as well, and most of the Middle East, or much of the Middle East. They did not, to be such a huge empire, they were not fighting over religion with people. They were not, even though they were an Islamic empire, it was Islamic ruled. They were Christian, Jewish, what they called millets. They were allowed to live in their village. They had to pay more taxes to practice their own religion, so they did have a higher tax rate than the Muslims. But other than that, they were left free to without persecution. There was a lot of different languages. Turkish was the language of the administration, but as Muslims, there was also Arabic there, and then people spoke their local languages. And the Ottomans generally let people keep their own cultures as well. And again, I would say in modern history, in modern class, I say much more about this, but this is all I'm going to say about the Ottomans for now. And I'm going to compare to the Safavid Empire, which is much smaller. You saw how huge the Ottoman Empire is. It was all of again, it goes into Eastern Europe, Middle East, North Africa, huge, right? Basically, the Safavid Empire was basically what we say modern day Iran, Persia. It was called Persia then. Iran is a more modern idea, but then they would have said Persia. And it's Shiite Islam. It's not, so the Ottoman Empire, and we're going to talk briefly about the Mughal Empire, were all Sunni Islam, but this was Shiite Islam. And we've talked about the Sunni-Shiite divide here. There was no religious tolerance. You not only you couldn't even be Sunni Islam, you had to be Shiite Islam. It was basically convert or die. Again, small pockets maybe of it's. I'm not going to get into the whole history of the Safavid Empire here, but basically, as a big level, it was Shiite Islam was the only religion there. Definitely the smallest Islamic empire, as I said, much smaller than the other two. And one thing was that religious intolerance made it difficult to expand. This is just a general thing, that if you want to fight about changing people's religion, it's a bloody, difficult thing, and it makes expansion extremely difficult. So this is why it was the smallest one. So you see this. And so this is just it doesn't look as much smaller just on the map because it's a more kind of focus on this, but you can kind of see this. It's basically modern day Iran. And then you see the Ottoman Empire over here, which would be, you can see sort of modern day Iraq and Iran. This is basically modern day Iraq and Iran. And then the Mughal Empire is over here, and here's modern day Afghanistan. The Mughal Empire was not as much of a result of the Black Death. The Black Death did not impact India as much. So I'm not going to say very much about this for this class. It was basically modern day India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. But since your text mentioned the three Islamic empires, it's really the Ottomans and the Safavids that were a direct reaction to the Black Death. It was very religiously tolerant. It was majority Hindu, and a very, very wealthy empire. And again, they did not also force conversion, which would have been a very difficult thing to do. But if you still today, the kind of the connection with today is India today is a majority Hindu, but a significant Muslim minority. And the Delhi Sultanate beforehand, and then the Mughal Empire were for thousands of years. It was or hundreds of years, many hundreds of years. It was Muslim ruled, but a majority Hindu population. Okay, Black Death in China. So out of the chaos emerged the group called the Red Turbans. And if this were just China, I talk a lot about the Red Turbans, but this is like a three-part kind of lecture. I'm really focusing on the Black Death. They were basically a Taoist Buddhist folk religion mix. You don't see in you don't see again in China. You don't see the same degree of fighting over religious doctrine that you do here. So there were some Taoists, there were some Buddhists, there was some just kind of folk religion in here. But you definitely see this idea of a religious response, a response that this is a supernatural crisis. It wasn't monotheistic in the same way that the Christian or the Islamic regions were, so there wasn't this idea of one God doing this. That's a difference. But there was a similarity in that this was something that that called for spiritual warfare. And also because everything was chaotic, this whole society was basically falling, especially in certain parts where the Black Death was. You're seeing this, and so you're seeing peasants revolting and trying for something new. It was an opportunity for peasants to gain power through rising in the ranks of the Red Turbans. You did see a lot of times in the ranks, and not always, but often in times of huge social dislocation, there will be time for social mobility. And so the Red Turbans were part of the overthrow of the Mongol dynasty, and Zhu Yuanming, who was preeminent, who became an important ruler of the Red Turbans, grew up as a poor peasant, but through the Red Turbans, he was able to become wealthy and power. Well, later on he was wealthy, but he became powerful in the Red Turbans, and he became the emperor of the new Ming dynasty. Again, there's all sorts of stories to go with this, but we're going to just leave it. Kind of leave it at that. But really, what I want you to focus on is kind of social mobility. A poor peasant is able to rise through the ranks, and this is why it was unusual, of course, for poor peasants to necessarily found dynasties. But in this case, this is what this happened, and a lot of it was because of the chaos that you see from the Black Death. Okay, so Zhu Yuanming, he first used kinsmen to help rule, but then he stripped them of power and he reinstated the civil service exam. And again, this is something we see going back to tradition. So when we look at the Christian, this is kind of one connection. So you can talk about the differences and the similarities between the two, like all three going back to tradition. You look at Europe, and then there's kind of going back to the traditions of the church, where the church becomes more powerful, so it becomes new in some ways or different in some ways, but it's still going back to religion. You see Islamic empires ruling is people kind of continuing and becoming, Islam was becoming more powerful during this time. And then you reinstate with the Chinese as the civil service exam, which is kind of a reinstatement of Confucianism, right? The civil service exam is still based on Confucian classics. So this was taken away under the Mongol dynasty. The Mongol dynasty didn't want, they wanted people who were loyal to the Mongols was much more important than the people who knew about Confucian classics. And this is one of the reasons why they were so bitterly resented, because that was such a huge thing. So the Ming dynasty reinstated the civil service exam. The emphasis is that they did have the mandate of heaven. In China, there's also the idea that you can lose the mandate of heaven, which people rarely, emperors would rarely say that they lost it. But this was actually a long empire. It didn't end. This was 1368. It started. It didn't end until 1644. I don't think I put the dates there, but I'm telling you now, it's 1368 to 1644. So it lasted for close to 300 years. It was quite a long-lasting dynasty. They were building a beautiful palaces to show the power of the emperor, and I chose to show you one. This is in Beijing. My family was there in the fall of 2017. I'm kind of camera shy, and I took this picture myself, but this is my husband and my older twins, and my little girl is there. This is one of the I think this is the Gugong. I think this is one of the palaces built by the Ming. Yes, it was one of the palaces built in the Ming Dynasty. I don't have a picture for you of the Forbidden City, but your text does, and it's really quite something. It doesn't look, of course, exactly like it looked, when the emperor, when everybody lived there, but you can actually go see the Forbidden City that they're talking about there, and those were things that were made to show the power of the emperor. The other thing that showed this, and I put this on the quiz because I thought it was an interesting thing to look at as well, is they planted the trees to help control the flooding. Massive planting of trees. And this is one thing why you had when people said they had the mandate of heaven, there's also this other part, like when you were a strong emperor and you had strong centralized power and you were able to rule well, one of the things you would do is try and control natural disaster. Now, some kinds of flooding would be impossible to control, like when the Yellow River changed course. But for ordinary flooding, the massive planting of trees can help control flooding, and this is also something that you can see a strong centralized empire. They can actually, a strong empire can hire people to actually to do this, and they can kind of focus on this. And so that was another part. So the building of palaces are things that we can visit today that we're most impressed with. Whereas, like, we don't see the planting of trees, even though we know about it. There's nothing it's not as amazing to look at. But for as far as people's lives go, of course, the planting of trees to help control flooding was probably more important in ruling in everyday people's lives than the fact that there were these beautiful palaces there. But they both kind of worked together, that things were basically kind of working well. This was absolutely the most centralized bureaucracy in the world. I'll definitely be looking for you to understand that about the Ming Dynasty. I mentioned languages earlier in Europe. So locally in China today, this is the same way. People all each have their own local dialect. So somebody from Shanghai, if they're speaking their Shanghai dialect, wouldn't be able to be understood from somebody, say, in Guangzhou in southern China. They would each speak their own dialect. But there's one central dialect that most educated people know, but also the writing. So anybody who learned to read or write had a common culture, because the writing was separate from the language. When you write in Chinese, it's characters, and they're completely separate from the pronunciation. I mentioned that before, but this is relevant still, this was relevant in keeping China as one large place. When you look at the Islamic empires, you see, of course, that there are 3 different empires, and of course Europe is many, many different states. But there's basically one large centralized rule in China. Rituals were very important. The emperor did many rituals. The Ming Empire were famous for their rituals, but there wasn't one religion consistently favored. It was more this vague idea of heaven. Religious belief, and this is something I said before in the last lecture, but that's important. Religious belief was not persecuted as long as it didn't interfere with state power. And this is something that kind of continued on, as I mentioned. Even today in China, there is suppression of Christianity. And there's theoretical religious freedom in the People's Republic of China, but this is not always practiced. But it's only... There's never this idea that, like, when we talked about European persecution, it would be this idea that, like, okay, well, if somebody isn't Christian or somebody doesn't believe the right thing, they'll lead other people astray, and so then we need to persecute them because of this belief. In China, it's not the belief itself that's a problem. It's a problem if it interferes with state power. And I'm not saying that anything is better or better or worse, but it's just a different view. There wouldn't be something like they would never say, okay, you're going to go to hell if you think that you're going to go to hell, and you're going to believe a lot of other people going to hell too. It wasn't just a Chinese concept, and it still isn't. But so it wasn't, and it got not one religion was favored consistently. So you see, this is something that's different, certainly, than in either of the other two areas that we've talked about. I'm just going to end with one more picture. One more picture. Yeah, Mira, you recognize this picture. That's my daughter. My daughter's a smaller one with the red hair, and that's her friend Sarah, who is from Australia.
I'm the smaller one. I was constantly reminded that by her.
And this is just another picture. You can see.
How cute I am?
No, you can see the Imperial Palace. You can see the another picture of the Imperial Palace.
And how cute I am.
Anyways, you can see that too. All right. So I just thought I'd end with that. Just sort of a nice little picture from when I was there a few years ago. As always, any questions? So the idea, so the kind of the last question is basically the kind of why does this matter question, or what can you take from this question? That's the easiest thing to do, is have a conversation about this. So hopefully, I'm going to be giving you a Zoom review session at 9:30 on May 7th. So that might be a good time to chat about that. You can also be thinking about this as well as you're writing your response, when you write your responses. A lot of people did a really nice job on their responses last week, bringing everything together, bringing the different kinds of questions together. Some people left out part of the question. It's not as serious to do that when you're just for the weekly responses, but if you answer a question for your final, I am going to be looking for you to make sure you're talking about all parts of this. And so as you're writing your response, it's good for you to think about the last part of the question. And I'll kind of see what you come up with, and then we can actually talk about it together. We can also talk about it together when we have our Zoom session, if you like, or you can email me with some of your thoughts and ideas. But that's something that I'd like you to think about. That's more of an open-ended part of the question. So there's the factual parts I just gave you, and then there's the more open-ended part. Okay, thank you very much. This is the last lecture. Although I can say if something confuses you, I'm happy to go over anything with you. I'm happy to set up a phone conversation with you. I can't have office hours in the same way. And I think having Zoom office hours where I'm just there isn't probably as effective as making appointments. So I'm just going to invite you to, if you would like to talk about the final questions, to give me some times that you're free and we can set up an appointment. Okay, thank you very much, and have